About to begin on another beautiful winter day in winter 2015 here in Boston. People won't believe the reports that came on the news last month about the city, but we've been very fortunate with the weather the last few days. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our conversations today and tomorrow, Righteous Among the Nations, a conference exploring the spiritual and ethical witness of Holocaust rescuers. We will be discussing the activities of those who risked their lives or lost their lives in their efforts to save Jewish life during the period of the Holocaust. Our gathering is sponsored by the Boston College Center for Christian Jewish Learning, and my name is James Bernauer. Together with Professor Ruth Langer and Dr. Camille Markey, we direct the center's efforts to enhance the bonds of friendship between Jews and Christians. Whenever I've asked my students, as well as others, to estimate how many righteous have been recognized by Israel's Yad Vashem Center, the numbers guessed are almost always ridiculously low. And this is a common viewpoint. Even the chairman of the committee for designating the righteous as late as 1974 doubted that planting a tree in honor of each rescuer, which had been the custom, would lead to a forest of trees on what has been designated the Avenue of the Righteous at the Yad Vashem campus. In fact, though, there has long been no space for the number of trees, and the names of the righteous are now honored not with a tree, but on a wall of remembrance, because there are so many. Perhaps this perception of the small numbers will become part of our discussion. Why is it the case? My own feeling is that the righteous have not yet found their place on the landscape of our moral and spiritual imagination. Despite the publication of the 10-volume encyclopedia of the righteous among the nations and the efforts of distinguished scholars, some of whom are with us today. There are people who claim that one clear reason for that is the modesty of these righteous. An important analyst of their own explanation for why they did asserts that only 3% of these righteous thought what they did in saving lives was extraordinary. Only 3%. And this among people who were putting their lives and often their family lives at risk of immediate execution for what they were doing. One of those honored by Israel was celebrated last year in a special way on the centennial of his birth, Jan Karski, who gave the moving report in the film Shoah on his visit to the Warsaw Ghetto, and who spent most of his life as a professor at Georgetown University, where tribute is paid to him now with a statue on the campus. There's another statue in front of the consulate, the Polish consulate in New York. I think it's around 23rd Street. But Karski criticized, he was very laudatory about the film Shoah, but he criticized Lanzmann, the creator of the film, for having ignored the rescuers. And he said that it was terribly important to remember them for two reasons. First, because they were a morally significant part of 20th century history. And he even went as far as to put forward a lesson to be learned, namely that institutions, not people, failed during the period of the Holocaust. This is how he expressed it in 1987. After all, it is not true that the Jews were totally abandoned. Over 500,000 Jews survived the Holocaust in Europe. Someone helped them. Nuns and peasants, workers and underground organizations. The Jews were abandoned by governments, social structures, church hierarchies, but not by ordinary men and women. End of quotation. The second reason Karski gave for increased remembrance was that the neglect of these rescuers perpetuates the idea that all are, or potentially are, anti-Semites. It seems to me that the very study of these righteous, and a meeting such as we're having here, represents an ongoing critique of anti-Semitism. Although Yad Vashem has done something exemplary in its effort to identify and honor the rescuers of Jews, its labor is but an invitation to more profound memory and more extensive scholarship. Our first speaker is one of the most eminent examples of that mission of memory and scholarship. It's my privilege to welcome Dr. Susan Zuccotti to Boston College and to our conversations today and tomorrow. She's familiar with the neighborhood, having done her bachelor's degree at Wellesley College down the road. She has her doctorate in history from Columbia University, and she has taught both there at Barnard College in New York and at Trinity College in Hartford. She is the author of numerous articles and of these books: The Italians in the Holocaust, Persecution, Rescue, and Survival, 1987. The Holocaust, the French and the Jews, 1993. Under His Very Window, the Vatican and the Holocaust in Italy, 2000. Holocaust Odysseys, the Jews of Saint-Marin-Vasubi and their flight through France and Italy, 2007. And most recently, Père Marie Benoit and Jewish Rescue, how a French priest, together with Jewish friends, saved thousands during the Holocaust. That's 2013. She has received 2 National Jewish Book Awards, as well as the Milton Memorial Prize of the German Studies Association. Her lecture today is entitled Père Marie Benoit, Rescuer of Jews in Marseille and Rome, His Character, Achievements, and Impact. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Susan Zuccotti.
Well, thank you for that lovely introduction. Thank you for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm very pleased to see such a nice, good-sized audience. So thank you all for coming. I am delighted to have the opportunity to introduce you today to Père Marie Benoit, a French Capuchin priest known also by his Italian name as Padre Maria Benedetto, who rescued thousands of Jews in Marseille, Nice, and Rome during the Second World War. I propose to divide my presentation into 2 parts. First, I will give you a general description of who he was, where he came from, how he was trained, how he got into rescue work, and what he did overall to help Jews. In the second part of my remarks, I will be more analytical, raising questions as to what was different and unique about his rescue work, why he did what he did, and what was the long-term impact of his rescue activities after the war. I hope that my analysis, and especially my reflections on the motivations and the long-term impact, will raise broader questions about rescue in general, questions that will be addressed by the panels that follow me today and tomorrow. The boy who became Père Marie Benoit was born in the small village of Le Bourg-d'Irey, north of Angers, in 1895, and named Pierre Pétole. His father was a miller for a time, but he moved his family to Angers when Pierre was still a child, and the family lived in modest circumstances. Pierre's native region of France was conservative and strongly Catholic, and so was Pierre's extended family. An uncle and 2 aunts were priests and nuns, and one of his 3 brothers also studied for the priesthood before he was killed in the First World War. Pierre was first educated at a local Catholic elementary school in Angers. At the age of 10, he witnessed the conflicts of the separation of church and state in France and the accompanying government inventories of church property. When he was 12, he decided that he wanted to become a priest. But because schools taught by members of religious orders were then prohibited in France because of the separation of church and state, Pierre, age 12, was obliged to travel to Belgium and later to Holland to continue his studies to become a priest and a member of a congregation. He never lived at home again. With the outbreak of the First World War in August 1914, Pierre Pétole, not yet ordained, returned to France to join the infantry, where he served until his demobilization in 1919. In other words, he fought the entire war, and he was, for a very large part of it, in the trenches at Verdun. His letters to his mentor during this period from the trenches describe the bloody violence that he saw, and the impact upon this sheltered young man can only be imagined. After the war, he returned to his studies in Holland, and he was soon chosen there to be transferred to Rome to continue to prepare for the priesthood and a teaching career at the prestigious Capuchin International College and at the even more prestigious Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome, run by the Jesuits. Young, hardy, and profoundly enthusiastic Pierre-Marie Benoit arrived in Rome in the autumn of 1921. There, he performed brilliantly in school. He enjoyed the cultural activities of cultural offerings of the Eternal City, and he witnessed the rise to power in 1922 of Benito Mussolini as Prime Minister of Italy, and with much more excitement, he witnessed the selection and consecration of Pope Pius XI. Pierre-Marie Benoit was ordained in 1923, and he was immediately appointed to be a professor at the Capuchin International College, where he himself had studied. With the outbreak of the Second World War and the eventual Italian declaration of war on France and Britain in June 1940, Pierre-Marie Benoit and other French Capuchins in Rome were repatriated for the duration of the conflict. Pierre-Marie Benoit was sent to the Capuchin monastery in Marseille. That city at that time was full of foreign refugees, Jews and non-Jews, escaping from French internment camps for enemy aliens and trying to live clandestine lives without proper documentation or sufficient financial resources. Many of them were hoping to leave the country altogether. Some of the most desperate refugees in Marseille found their way to Pierre-Marie Benoit's door. I should point out, I think I have not, that this now, Marseille in the south, was in the unoccupied zone after the defeat of the French army in June of 1940 and the German occupation of northern France. The Vichy regime was imposed and installed in the southern zone, or the unoccupied zone of France, and that's where Pierre-Marie Benoit was, in Marseille. He had been giving public lectures at a convent of the Sisters of Notre Dame de Zion on the need for Catholics to demonstrate sympathy and compassion for the victims of war, including but not limited to the Jews. The word spread throughout Marseille. Perhaps this priest would be willing to do more than just lecture. He gradually became more and more involved, helping Jewish and non-Jewish refugees to find places to stay and to obtain false papers and hopefully move across borders to safety in Spain and Switzerland. It is quite probable that these activities would have continued on a limited scale, but they would surely not have soared to the levels they finally reached if Pierre-Marie Benoit had not been approached by a man who subsequently became not just a colleague, but a cherished friend. That man was Joseph Bass, a brilliant and charismatic Jewish immigrant from Grodno, young businessman, lawyer, and engineer. Joseph Bass had been working with Jewish refugees in France since the 1930s. Between 1939 and 1941, he and a few, mostly Jewish associates, worked to help Jews without papers who were trying to elude the Vichy French authorities and stay out of internment camps and labor camps in the unoccupied zone. By mid-1942, however, the situation had drastically deteriorated. Between August and October 1942, Vichy police, still operating in the still unoccupied zone of France, so still without German presence, rounded up some 11,000 Jewish immigrants and refugees from specific countries associated with the Third Reich, who had arrived recently in France and delivered them to the Germans in the occupied zone of France. Nearly all of these 11,000 victims were promptly deported to Auschwitz, and few returned. Now the danger for the Jewish refugees remaining in the unoccupied zone was overwhelming. And again, I'm talking about refugees, foreigners, Jews in France who were not French Jews. These people now realized that they were lucky to have survived those August and September 1942 roundups, but that they were in great danger for the future. And Joseph Bass was asked to help, and he needed more help himself. Joseph Bass met and appealed to Père Marie Benoit for help, and the priest accepted. Now, even before the roundups of August 1942, Joseph Bass, always an eccentric and very independent character, had developed very precise ideas about how Jewish refugees should be helped. Above all, he thought, they should not stick together, and they should not remain in contact with well-meaning official charitable organizations, either Jewish or non-Jewish. Refugees, Joseph Bass believed, should be provided with good false papers and then isolated and hidden in the smallest possible family groups. This seems obvious to us now, knowing what was going to happen, but it was not so obvious at that time. And there were many Jewish organizations with wonderful records of helping orphans, old people, sick people, hospitals. It was very tempting for refugees without papers to try to stick together in the security offered, they thought, and certainly the support, the moral support offered by these organizations. Joseph Bass's network, known as the Service André, helped secure safe houses and false papers for these people, and then continued to hide them and supply them while they were in hiding with money, ration books, and moral support. Père Marie Benoit became an active participant in this unique rescue effort, unique yet in France. Just beginning, these kinds of things were just beginning to be done in the summer of 1942. And his rescue network, or Joseph Bass's rescue network, came to include both Jews and non-Jews, young men and young women, and several other priests. A lot of the young people were not Jewish, but those who were Jewish would have been about your age, and they would have lost their jobs and their hopes for the future because of the racial laws, the anti-Jewish laws in France, which were preventing them from working. So a number of these Jewish young people gravitated to Joseph Bass, and non-Jews young people did the same. From his work with Joseph Bass, Père Marie Benoit learned the techniques and the tricks of clandestine activity. And when you think about it, you really had to learn this. I mean, these were law-abiding, respectable priests, lawyer, engineer. How do you deal with clandestine life? You ease into it and you learn the ropes. Père Marie Benoit also learned how to call upon sympathetic local authorities, of which there were a good number, and diplomats, when his group needed help. In other words, he learned to play the system. For reasons that remain obscure, Père Marie Benoit was called back to Rome by the head of the Capuchin order in July of 1943. He didn't want to leave Marseille, and he was also working in Nice by this time. He appealed to his superiors in Rome, describing the invaluable rescue work that he was engaged in, but all in vain. But irony of ironies, this now highly skilled and experienced rescuer of fugitives and player of the system then found himself in Rome in September 1943, when, after the signing of the Italian armistice with the Allies and the consequent German occupation of Italy and its occupied territories, thousands of Jews who were fleeing from southern France to get away from the Germans and hoping to reach Allied lines in southern Italy suddenly descended on the Eternal City. What were they going to do? As previously in France, these refugees were without documents, contacts, money, or even the ability to speak the local language, Italian. Thanks to his experience in Marseille and Nice, Père Marie Benoit knew exactly what to do. He even knew some of the Jewish refugees personally who had come to Italy from France. A wonderfully effective rescue network rapidly emerged in Rome. Technically, its head was Settimio Sorani, a local representative of the Delegazione Assistenza Emigranti Ebrei, known by its acronym as DELASEM, a pre-existing nationwide Italian Jewish organization devoted to helping Jewish immigrants and refugees. Although with the arrival of the Germans, DELASEM's Jewish social workers had to go underground, many, like Sorani, courageously continued their rescue efforts in secret. The organization was also able to maintain, to a limited extent, its sources of funding from the Joint and from local Italian Jewish contributors. But the acting director of the DELASEM network was now Père Marie Benoit, who could maintain a public presence as a priest in Rome much more comfortably than Sorani, a Jewish Italian. From all over Rome, this Capuchin rescuer, this Capuchin priest, recruited other priests, nuns, monks, to accept Jewish refugees in their religious institutions. He directed former DELASEM workers and new Jewish and non-Jewish volunteers to escort refugees to their hiding places, manufacture and hand out false papers, residence permits, ration cards, all the things you needed to be in hiding, in a city in particular, to distribute weekly or monthly subsidies to keep people alive and extra supplies of food, clothing, and medicine, and to visit fugitives and relieve them from their terrible isolation in hiding. Père Marie Benoit drew upon his knowledge of the local scene to contact sympathetic diplomats in Rome from Switzerland, Hungary, the United States, Britain, and other countries, Roman policemen and municipal officials. He knew which ones to call upon for help. A Vatican prelate here or there, a mother superior, a director of a boys' Catholic boys' school, all potential helpers in his work. And he drew upon his friendship with French Monsignor Joseph Hérisset, who lived in the Vatican City, to approach the American chargé d'affaires to the Holy See and the British ambassador to the Holy See to ask for help in a complex scheme to guarantee local loans to the rescue network with the promise of repayment in dollars after the war. Believe me, these financial issues were crucial and critical and difficult. Père Marie Benoit testified after the war that he received no help, financial or otherwise, from the Vatican itself. But he was helped by a broad spectrum of local political and religious communities. He and his group are believed to have saved at least 2,500 Jews in Rome. Now, now to the more analytical and less descriptive part, one of the first questions that we might ask about Père Marie Benoit's rescue operation is how it was unique and different from other efforts associated with men and women of the church. It differed, first of all, in its origins. Like most rescuers, Père Marie Benoit became involved because he was asked, like most rescuers. But he was not asked because he just happened to be the priest on the scene. If you study the patterns and the stories of rescuers, you find very often that parish priests in small towns were sometimes asked to help by local Jews, by Jews passing through, by refugees, by fugitives, by terrified people. They were sometimes, these local parish priests, asked to help because it was hoped that although they might say no, they would at least not be villainous. They would not be likely to turn whoever was asking for help into the police. So that in itself was a reason for approaching them in a small town. And that was not the case with Père Marie Benoit. Also, I have studied bishops in Italy, in Genoa, Florence, Turin, and Milan, to great extent, and they were individuals who established or supported local rescue networks, but they were asked to do so by de Lessem because of their leadership positions in the diocese or because of their broader connections to a region. None of these bishops were known previously to be sympathetic with Jews, and in some cases quite to the contrary. But Père Marie Benoit was asked to help in Marseille because he was already recognized to be sympathetic to the Jews. He had made that known. Furthermore, there was nothing spontaneous about his rescue activities. He edged into them gradually, deliberately, and with full understanding of what he was getting into. First, he helped those who knocked on his door, then he became involved with Joseph Bass, and then he set up his own rescue network in Rome. More important than the origins of the network, however, Père Marie Benoit's rescue activities were unusual in the extent to which they represented a collaborative effort between Catholics and Jews. And that is, in a sense, why he and his story are so appropriate to this particular conference with our particular focus. I cannot emphasize this aspect of his work strongly enough. Père Marie Benoit worked in Marseille and Nice with Joseph Bass, and the two men became fast friends for life. Also in Marseille was Denis Karako-Sikirski, whom I have met, who is now still living in Israel, a very young French-Jewish social worker who could not work because of the anti-Jewish laws, and who became very involved with the Service André as a courier escorting refugees to hiding places. Denise adored Père Marie Benoit, and she adored Joseph Bass. She remained in close contact with them both as long as they lived, and she wrote about them after they died. Other young men and women in the Service André, Joseph Bass organization, did the same. It was a team effort, and the team consisted of Jews and non-Jews working together. In Rome, the Joseph Bass equivalent was a man named Stefan Schwamm, a young and brilliant Jewish lawyer from Vienna, who I believe appealed to Père Marie Benoit because of his panache, his daring, his imagination. I've met his son, and I've read Stefan Schwamm's letters and works, and he was an extraordinary character. There was nothing dull or boring about these people. They were people that we would all love to know. In many ways, while Père Marie Benoit had the local Catholic contacts in Rome and was able to secure hiding places in church institutions and in secular pensioni throughout the city, Stefan Schwamm supplied the imagination and the sense of adventure necessary to maintain morale and commitment. Also in Rome in 1943, working with these characters, was Aaron Kasterstein, an Orthodox Jewish immigrant from Poland who had been active in the communist resistance. So put all that together and figure out the kind of character that he must have been. Kasterstein, according to both Père Marie Benoit and Schwamm, was the real brains behind the operation, conceiving of new ways to elude hostile authorities and enlist sympathetic ones. And it's fun to think of all of this, I think, in our own terms, in our own lives, and how it would be to be doing something like this under the very noses of the hostile authoritarian authorities. Both Kasterstein and Schwamm, being Jewish, could bring in the clients, the foreign Jews whom they located and who trusted them, and with whom they could communicate, whether in German, Polish, Yiddish, Hebrew, Russian, or more. And as in the case of Joseph Bass, Père Marie Benoit remained in constant touch with these men and with Denise Sikorsky, so these men and women and other women whom I have met, after the war. And the friendships, those friendships that the priests' Vatican authorities frowned upon in those days, and that probably hurt his career. More important and more interesting, perhaps, than the question of how Père Marie Benoit became involved in Jewish rescue and how his rescue efforts were unique is the issue of why he was so sympathetic to the Jews in the first place. Unfortunately, no one really knows the answer to this. We do know that his sympathies preceded the Second World War by at least 14 years. For as early as 1926 or 1927, he had joined an organization called Amici Israeli in Rome, an organization of about 3,000 mostly French and Italian priests, 278 bishops and archbishops, and 19 cardinals, devoted to promoting mutual respect and dialogue between Jews and Catholics, and in the eyes of some, but not all members, creating conditions favorable to the conversion of the Jews. Still another subject. But we do not know why he joined that organization. I have speculated that perhaps Père Marie Benoit's childhood experiences as a fervent, earnest young Catholic in a strongly anti-clerical France at the time of the separation of church and state in the first decade of the 20th century left him with a certain empathy and compassion for minority groups. This is the same argument that is put forth to explain Pastor André Trocmé and the Protestants in the French village of Le Chambon-sur-Lignon, who shared the memory of themselves as Protestants being a persecuted minority in the hands of French Catholic state in the 16th and 17th centuries, and were allegedly, for that reason, highly sympathetic to the Jews as a result. But of course, it does not always work that way, does it? Minorities are not, unfortunately, invariably sympathetic to other minorities. However, in her fascinating analysis in her book, When Light Pierced the Darkness, of why rescuers in Poland acted as they did, historian and sociologist Nahama Tek found that one characteristic that Polish rescuers shared was that of being nonconformists and outsiders in the society. They didn't share, she found, Polish rescuers now, they didn't share anything about class or education or urban versus rural or any of the characteristics you think they might share, but they did share this tendency to be nonconformists and outsiders in the society, with a consequent tendency to form opinions and act upon them quite independently of those around them. Although Père Marie Benoit was not an outsider in his home region or at the Catholic schools he attended, he was exactly that in the broader secular French society at the time. And that status of being a slight outsider may have affected his vision and his sensibility. I've also considered other possibilities to explain Père Marie Benoit's liking for the Jewish people, but I can find no proof. So it's not in my book, but it's speculation. For the first time in his young, sheltered life, Père Marie Benoit, during his military service in the First World War, met men from all classes, all races, and all educational, cultural, and religious backgrounds. It's highly probable that many of these new acquaintances were Jewish. Was he influenced by some of them? Or was there a teacher in his seminary in Holland, or a Capuchin college in Rome, or a Jesuit Gregorian university who was particularly sympathetic to the Jews? We will never know. A Catholic woman who worked with Père Marie Benoit in Marseille later wrote that he had befriended a couple of rabbis in the former ghetto of Rome when he was studying Hebrew at the Gregorian University. And that prompted his interest in and his liking for the Jewish people. He may have told her that, but it's not certain. Whatever other explanations exist, Père Marie Benoit's liking for the Jewish people was clearly embedded in his personality. Remember that he had an immense intellectual capacity and curiosity. And again, this is not in my book because it's pure speculation, and historians are supposed to document their facts and document their statements. But he had an immense intellectual capacity and curiosity. As a student and scholar, he had studied the Old Testament and learned Hebrew. Suddenly, this intellectually curious man met what he regarded as the people of the book, and he was interested and sympathetic. But perhaps more important, consider also that his life as a priest and a teacher in the seminary in Rome may have been, in those days particularly, it may well have been somewhat constrained, austere, routine, repetitive, confining. Père Marie Benoit liked people, and he had a love of travel that he could not freely indulge in as a priest. We see that love of travel clearly in his brief notebooks. The Jews he met during the Second World War were not only Jews, but they were also refugees from distant lands with interesting, if tragic, stories. The Jewish rescuers of Jews, furthermore, were dynamic, interesting, adventurous people who brought a certain spice to the priest's life. Perhaps also they were warmer, more lively, more imaginative, more iconoclastic, less severe than the men with whom Père Marie Benoit spent most of his time in the monastery. I do not mean it to be diminishing if I say that I think the adventure was part of the lure of rescue activities for him. This period of his life was, I think, the highlight of his life. I would now like to turn just briefly to Père Marie Benoit's post-liberation experience and the impact of his rescue work the impact that his rescue work had on the rest of his life and on those around him. The Allies entered Rome, liberated Rome, on June 4th, 1944. Just 4 days later, at 9 a.m. on the 8th of June, there was a celebratory ceremony in Rome's central synagogue that was jammed with people. Père Marie Benoit may have even been a little bit surprised by the incredibly warm reception that he received. After the religious part of the service, Sorani, the former leader of DLSM in Rome, spoke. And then the priest, Père Marie Benoit, was invited to say a few words. In Sorani's account of this event, Père Marie Benoit, and I quote now, the priest began by saying that he regretted that he did not belong to the people of Israel, for whom he had such a liking and whom he had tried to help with all his strength, end quote. These were extraordinary words from a priest of the Catholic Church in 1944, at a time when priests were not even supposed to go into a synagogue. As Père Marie Benoit himself wrote of that event in 1984, quote again, that a Capuchin priest, that a Catholic, spoke in the great synagogue of Rome was to begin that Judeo-Christian rapprochement that we are trying to realize now, end quote. Long before 1984, Père Marie Benoit had written about the same event in the synagogue in 1944, and he wrote, and one more quote, "Everyone came to shake my hand. They gave me an ovation at the exit. They called me the Father of the Jews, a name that I have kept and of which I am proud," end quote. The Jewish community subsequently remained overwhelmingly supportive and receptive to this unassuming Capuchin. They invited him to receptions. They gave him awards and tokens of recognition, and perhaps most impressive, when he or his work were occasionally questioned or misrepresented by Osservatore Romano or other Catholic critics, the Jewish community leadership in Rome always gave him an opportunity to respond and state his point of view in the local Jewish newspaper. And he did exactly that. There's no question that the Jews in Rome and the national Jewish leadership deeply appreciated Père Marie Benoit's work, and that work assured them that improvements in Jewish-Catholic relationships would be forthcoming, if slow. Of course, the rescue work of all men and women of the church, and indeed of all non-Jewish rescuers, was appreciated by and reassuring to the Jews. But there was something special about Père Marie Benoit. I'm biased, of course, but there was something special about him. His warmth, his honesty, his obvious sincerity, and his total commitment that did not end with the liberation, but continued stronger than ever until the priest died in 1990. In addition to his post-war charitable activity on behalf of Jewish refugees and his continued friendships with individual Jews, Père Marie Benoit began a series of public lectures on the Old Testament on October 8, 1944, that were attended by Jews and non-Jews alike. As he later wrote to a Vatican official who had questioned him about the lectures, quote, "I thought it opportune to maintain and consolidate spiritually the drawing together of Jews and Christians that had occurred. The study of the Old Testament is a common ground, I tell them, on which we can meet and meditate together on the great religious teachings of the Word of God." End quote. He called his lecture group Amicizia Ebraico-Cristiana. While these activities and friendships were reassuring and hopeful for most Jews and some Catholic clergy and laypersons, they unquestionably made Vatican officials extremely nervous. It's difficult to find extensive evidence of this, but there is some. Documents published in the Vatican 11-volume Actes et Documents du Saint-Siège from the war period indicate that even during the German occupation of Rome, some Vatican officials had expressed uncertainty about what Père Marie Benoit was doing. On several occasions after liberation, the priest was called upon to defend his activities to officials suspicious of prolonged personal social contact between Catholics and anyone outside the Catholic faith. Vatican officials also disapproved, and it's hard for us to remember all of this today, so much has changed, but Vatican officials at that time also disapproved of the critical study by laymen of Scripture. They disliked any emphasis on what Jews and Christians had in common, if you can believe it. It's hard to believe, but they did. And the Vatican officials refused to entertain suggestions that traditional church teachings about the Jewish people could be altered. Père Marie Benoit represented a challenge to them on all of these issues. His lectures on the Old Testament were allowed to continue only until May of 1945. Clearly, Père Marie Benoit made a contribution to the changes that were finally instituted by Vatican II. I would not go so far as to say that he exercised pressure on the Vatican, but he certainly added to the circulation of new ideas and lent them the prestige of his reputation as a hero. But he was also almost never publicly confrontational or disobedient. He expressed his ideas mostly in private reports and letters. As the years passed, he occasionally wrote an article. He only disagreed publicly with a Vatican spokesman when that person wrote something about him that was untrue. For all his work for Jewish-Christian reconciliation in the immediate post-war period, Père Marie Benoit played no obvious public or official leadership role in the ecumenical movement. The reasons for this are not clear. And I think because of time constraints, I shall cut a paragraph or two about that. But The fact is that Père Marie Benoit was sent out of Rome by his order in 1953 to a very small provincial Capuchin college in the south of Italy. In effect, he was demoted, and this is an instance of a lack of Vatican approval for what he had done, not so much what he was doing in the post-war period. I cut a bit here since I think I'm taking too long, but I'm almost finished. Père Marie Benoit was designated a righteous among the nations by Yad Vashem in 1966. He was immensely proud of this honor, and he mentioned it constantly. His Capuchin confrères were also tremendously proud of him, and I am sure it is safe to say that the designation helped his Capuchin brothers, and French and other clergy in general to comprehend more clearly the unique horror of the Jewish experience during the Second World War. We know now that during the first 2 decades after the Second World War, and again, this also is hard to believe, a full understanding of the specificity of Jewish wartime victimization did not exist among many French and other people. French and other people saw the persecution of the Jews during the Second World War as a persecution that had happened to lots of people and did not understand the uniqueness of the Jewish experience. The Yad Vashem Award rendered a great service in altering this lack of understanding. Now, one final question that I have been asked with respect to this conference: does the church ever tell the story of the righteous? And to what effect and with what enthusiasm? I imagine, and I hope, and I trust that others on our panels today and tomorrow will address this complex question more generally. But with regard to Père Marie Benoit, I would just say that quite apart from the admiration of many Catholic clergy and laypersons, the Vatican itself did not and has not given him much recognition. When he is evoked by Vatican spokesmen or papal defenders, it is usually to attribute his initiative, his efforts, and his results to Pope Pius XII. This distortion, sad as it is and absolutely contrary to what Père Marie Benoit himself said, will surely change. It is profoundly to be hoped that Pope Francis, for all of his other difficulties and issues and thorny problems, will give some consideration to the accurate portrayal of the righteous and indeed to Christian responses to and responsibility for the Holocaust. Thank you.